If you're an HR professional who works hard to fill roles within your company, keep employees engaged, and build company culture, welcome to America Back to Work, where dreams only work if we do. We'll share wide-ranging issues surrounding pre-employment background screening, HR topics such as recruiting, hiring, labor trends, and company culture, as well as broader HR-influenced business topics such as customer experience, service level excellence, and protecting what matters through best practices in prevention, protection, and corporate security. America Back to Work is brought to you by S2 Verify. Here's your host, Arnette Heintze.
Welcome to America Back to Work, brought to you by S2 Verify, where our purpose is to help you hire with confidence and manage insider risk. I'm your host, Arnette Heintze. Thank you for joining. Today, our guest is Gill Godfrey. Gill is a career HR leader with deep experience at large corporations across many industries, including her own consulting firm. Gill has built HR organizations from the ground up, as well as managed teams of more than 30 HR pros. Gill currently serves as the Chief People Officer at Storable, where they make software that helps storage operators do more. Gill, I'd love for you to tell us about Storable and how it came to be, as well as other experiences in your career that you think our audience would find interesting. I know you've had significant integration experience with mergers and acquisitions, so I'd like to hear a little bit about that. Welcome to the show.
Great. Thank you, Arnette. I appreciate it very much. So Storable was formed in 2009, and at the time was founded by Chuck Gordon, who is our current CEO. And at the time, it was actually just a marketplace business. So it was called Sparefoot, and Sparefoot was basically serving the needs of individuals like you or I that might be looking for a self-storage unit. So we were the marketplace for self-storage. Since then, the business has gone on to make probably 11 or 12 acquisitions across the various product lines that operators would be using. That might be insurance, that might be access control. The main product that we're selling to our customers is the actual FMS platform. So it's the facility management software that operators would be using to run their facilities. And it's a fascinating industry to be a part of. Once you actually think about self-storage, you'll notice how many self-storage units and operators you'll see just driving down a street.
Everywhere.
They are absolutely everywhere. It's a tremendous business to be a part of. So we have done a lot of M&A activity, and we have acquired companies that have been selling different product lines, which means that we're actually able to serve the entire ecosystem of the self-storage industry. And through those acquisitions, we've learned many things. We learned something new with each acquisition. But our primary focus when we're going through an acquisition and integration is on all things change management.
Yeah. How
do we integrate, the new team into the business? How do we adjust the organizational structure appropriately to ensure appropriate integration? Where we start is with all things back of house, which we call the enabling functions. So we would first of all integrate our HR, IT, finance, all of the back-end systems. Ultimately, then we would go further to integrate all of the other teams into the new organization. And for the most part, when we've acquired those companies, the founders of those companies have remained in the business, serving a particular purpose, maybe leading that part of the organization or actually taking on a different role. But change management would be what we focus on first and foremost to enable people, to get back to productivity as soon as they possibly can after they've absorbed the news of the acquisition.
Yeah. So that addresses the issue of maybe some of the first steps you focus on. What about the broader strategy, the greater strategy of implementing the M&A process? Any other steps along the way that you could offer up that kind of support the greater strategy that you're pursuing?
In addition to change management, the first thing that we'll do we sort of go through a discovery period. So the first 30, 60 days after the deal has been done will be discovery, where we will look very, very deeply into the organization, into the capabilities of the organization, and see where there may or may not be parity. So if I think about it just specifically from an HR standpoint, because we're acquiring organizations that might be smaller than ours, one of the first things that we're going to look at is what does pay look like in the new organization? And of course, during due diligence, we would have done a lot of that, but it's not really until after the deal is signed that we can get under the hood. One of the things fine because they are smaller organizations is that titles may not match. So, for example, in a smaller org, it may be that somebody's been there for a while, they might have the title of director. When we compare the salary of that person in a smaller org called the director to our organization, which is significantly larger, we often find that we've got gaps. And so we would look primarily at the base salary. We look obviously at what the OTE would be within that organization. The other piece that actually is quite interesting is the benefits piece and insurance. We pride ourselves on offering what we would consider to be very competitive insurance offering, both kind of the core offering and some of the peripherals that we offer. We have found that in some of the smaller companies, those insurance offerings may not be as great. And so consequently, we may have to phase in the new insurance offerings over a period of time to ensure that we're hitting all of the numbers in the deal model. So we look at that very carefully. We obviously take a hard look at all things, HRIS. So from a system standpoint, when do we move people onto payroll? What does that mean to tax, et cetera, et cetera? So there's an enormous amount of operational pieces that we focus on as well. And we'll have individuals within the teams, we'll have an operations kind of focus, we'll have the change management focus, and all of that is being led by an integration manager, whose sole responsibility is to ensure once the deal is done, they then take over from there, and they are the conduit between newly acquired business and the enterprise.
Yeah. So, your experience just screams that you've come across many different structures of human resources. And have you got any insight that you can give us about what HR structures maybe succeed the best?
Yeah. Just in my humble opinion, we have, what's interesting actually, Arnette, is once we moved to a fully remote model, we completely changed our organizational structure. And so I do think that some of the structure may be dictated by whether you are a remote company, whether you are, distributed, but you have offices, or whether you are a hybrid organization. Mm-hmm. We, when we pivoted to a remote world, we had 5 offices that we closed. At that point, we actually created new roles. So we created a community program manager role who is entirely responsible for all things community. And by that, I mean the Storable community as well as our role in a broader community. We did not have that role previously. We also pivoted our HR business partners who previously were allied to a site. Now they are allied to a department. And so given that we are remote, there are no sites, they are completely embedded in the functions that they serve, whether that's engineering or product or marketing, et cetera. So we have HR business partners that are field facing. And then we now have a relatively small talent acquisition team who partner with the HR business partners. And we have a shared services team that is taking care of all things payroll, benefits, and back of house, and compensation. We do not have in our organization today a fully kind of fledged learning and development organization. I would tell you that we're pretty scrappy when it comes to all things L&D. My approach is always to, when the new organization comes, or when I might be going into a new organization, is to look at the HR organization with regards to are we crawling, walking, or running? And when I think about the individual silos within HR, I always try to determine, okay, if we're crawling in compensation, is that okay at the moment? Do we need to be walking or running? And if the answer is no, you know, where do we need to deploy money and resource against in order to get the HR organization to a point where it can adequately support, the business goal?
Yeah. And, I know that Storable is completely remote now. And so you've obviously seen a change in how HR changes in that. What insight can you give us into that regard?
Probably like any HR leader in the world, I'm going to say the last 3 years has been the biggest learning curve. And it's been enormous. The decision to go remote was probably one of the largest decisions I've ever been involved in. Every decision since then actually seemed a lot smaller, to be honest with you. I think it's a fascinating process to go through because quite clearly you cannot pivot if the C-suite and the senior management team aren't aligned. And so what we've seen is leaders having to get used to be very good at this and really lean in to a very different style of communication. We've talked an enormous amount about psychological safety and what does that mean. We've gone back to the drawing board in terms of teaching leaders and managers how to be effective communicators, how to hold people accountable in a remote world. And I would tell you that I think our culture today, if you look at our ENPS scores, our ENPS score was highest within probably the first 6 to 9 months of the pandemic, because I think people were just very grateful to be safe and they didn't have to be, traveling into an office. Our ENPS score has dipped a little since then, but it is still higher than it ever was when we had offices. And I think the feeling of community that we built has been quite remarkable. And Zoom and Slack has played a huge part in that. But the last 3 years has been quite incredible, as I'm sure every HR leader around the world would tell you in terms of some of the challenges that we've had to face.
Yeah. I'd like to take you back to the time when you were running your own independent consulting business, because I think many of our audience, they're at some point in time in their careers, they think about, should I step into that consulting role? What insights can you share with us about that experiences and the challenges you have as an independent consultant?
That I think probably the biggest challenge was identifying when to work in the business and when to work on the business. And you need to be proficient, if not better than proficient, at marketing the organization. I probably, myself and my business partner at the time, we probably underestimated the amount of marketing that we should have been doing. So while we were very happy to get a gig, a month away, we weren't necessarily thinking about 6 months after that. I think personally what I found was I found it wonderful to build relationships with clients, to understand the dialogue to have with clients, whether that was pitching an initial proposal to them or working with them in their business. That relationship was absolutely key. What I missed was leading a team and the camaraderie that comes with that, because it is obviously much more transactional. And so I think for anybody that is looking to build relationships and they enjoy more of the transactional nature or a short time or short-term gig, it's probably a great way to go. For those individuals that enjoy building and being in the infrastructure and, taking something from sort of start to finish, I guess, could be TBD. What does finish look like? That I missed when I was working in the consulting world, for sure.
Yeah. And, it seems like every month we have a new buzzword in the HR area, but, also in the consulting area, the new words come up. People have been talking about quiet hiring. It's a trend of companies reacting to tight labor markets and asking employees to do more. And sometimes when they can't find the employees that are there to do more, they fill that gap with 1099 workers. What are your thoughts on that concept there?
We are always looking to understand, if you like, a burgeoning cost base.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it is imperative that every HR leader looks at their organizational model with a view to how do you augment your FTEs. And in order to, again, looking at the long-term kind of targets of the organization, whether they be financial, whether they be strategic targets, when you look at your organizational model, and if I look out at a long-term financial plan, how am I ensuring that my FTE base is not growing so fast that I'm putting a strain on those financial targets? Mm-hmm. And so we are always looking at opportunity to augment, whether that's onshore, whether that's nearshore or offshore. And we look at we look at activity as projects. So if something is project-based, then there is a distinct piece of work that needs to be delivered. Do I have to have an FTE to do that? Or could I augment with a 1099? Could I partner with an employer of record? Could I partner with a third-party firm that could deliver a piece of work? But what I'm not doing is I'm not adding in the additional cost that comes with an FTE. And I'll go back to what I said about the insurance piece. One thing is certain, that insurance cost to any organization just increases year over year over year, regardless of, tweaks that we might make to plans, etc. And so when I look out again at the long range model, knowing that insurance costs are likely to increase 7 to 8% over time, regardless of our playing industry, what does that mean? And so the partnership with the finance team is about as tight as it has to get. And so that is something that we're looking at the whole time and tweaking the sort of the organizational model accordingly, whilst understanding what is the core, where would we never augment, because we have to have that tribal knowledge in the business and we want to pay for that tribal knowledge to be retained.
Yeah. A new trend that's emerging in the HR field, I understand, is this concept of conscious quitting. And it's been determined that there's a younger generation that is, engaging this trend, which is identified when, the organization isn't living up to their corporate values and social responsibilities. And I know Storable has a CSR initiative. How's that challenge been for you? And are you confronting that dilemma?
I think if we talk about values first, we've worked very, very hard to ensure that our values come to life every day. Whether that's recognizing contribution and behaviors via a Slack channel that rewards people, or our CEO every 2 weeks in a video that he puts out for the organization. And he'll cite great examples. They are all tied back to one of our 4 values. When we were purchased by EQT, which is our majority backer, EQT is an organization that is very, very, very focused on long-term sustainability. And so we then, at that point, developed the ESG roadmap. And we have distinct activity in place for all things E, S, and G, and have a long-term objective with regard to each of those 3 pillars of the ESG framework, including how do we work with suppliers? Are we working with vendors and suppliers who are also mindful of ESG? In order to hold ourselves accountable, we report on progress every quarter to the board. We also report on progress on a monthly basis to our organization in all hands, etc. And we'll talk about, the ERG groups that we have. We've encouraged, we have about 8 ERG groups in the organization at the moment. Each of them is sponsored by an executive sponsor to ensure that they get the support, the platform that they need to make their mission come to life, if you like.
Yeah. Well, Jill, we're coming to the end of our time today. And before we sign off, I want to ask you a question that I asked every guest, which is if S2 Verify were to conduct a background screen on you today, would there be any surprises?
I don't think you'd find surprise. What you'd see if you looked at my resume would be that I have probably hot countries a lot. So you'd probably need to do more than one background check to tell the truth. You probably need to go to other European countries as well. So I could probably get away with some stuff. Yeah. But I think that's about probably the only thing that you'd see. So yes, you'd have to use an international background firm, Arnette.
Yeah, that's, it's really interesting you bring that concept up because a lot of organizations don't really fully understand the challenges of background screening when it comes to different states and especially when you get to different countries and involving different areas. So, Jill, I want to thank you so much for your time today and sharing your insights. You've given a lot of insight here, I think, especially into the M&A area that I think some of our audience can appreciate. And for our audience, please tune in next week when we continue our series about getting America back to work with Patrick Rogan of Ignition HR. And it goes without saying, let's get America back to work because dreams only work if we do.
If you want to stay abreast of HR, recruiting, and hiring trends, tips, and tools, make sure you subscribe to America Back to Work. If you enjoyed this episode, leave us a rating and a review.